right.
Oh, and get the, do you have the recording?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have that one as well.
All right, we should be live now, in theory.
In theory,
Yeah.
Once the Twitch buffers, finally catch up with however many seconds they need,
Yeah.
we're good. All right.
So yeah, I guess we can start just kind of introducing ourselves. So we'll go around the table. I'm Jake. I'm one of the programmers on the team.
Hi, I'm Chaoji. I'm also a programmer.
I'm BD, also a programmer.
I'm Jared. I'm the producer.
And I'm sitting off screen taking notes, but I'm Caleb. I'm the fourth programmer on the team.
Okay, the off-screen programmer.
Yes.
Okay.
And yeah, just kind of give you a little bit of background about our project. So we're at school at Carnegie Mellon at the Entertainment Technology Center. And so part of that is after your first semester, you do semester-long projects where you just kind of focus on doing one thing. And so this semester, we're focusing on building a game engine, seeing how that goes. So we kind of been doing our research in it of okay, what before the semester started of what goes into a game engine. And there's a lot of things out there like Handmade Hero and Jason Gregory's game engine architecture book that kind of go over all of it. But we really didn't feel like we would know how to do it until we kind of sat down and tried to do it ourselves.
That's very true. That's very true.
And so we're going through that, and then the goal of the semester is to kind of go through and when we were looking at how other people did it, we found a lot of people who would wait till the end. A lot of the other student projects, they'd wait till the end and then tell you all about all the cool features they did, but no one really, there wasn't many others like the Handmade Heroes series that kind of went through their decisions and their thoughts throughout the whole thing. And so we kind of want to go through the whole semester of documenting, okay, we made this decision and this is why. It's probably not the right decision, but we'll see where it goes. And then 2 months down the line, kind of say, oh, this is why it was the wrong decision.
Gotcha.
And then talking to professionals like yourself about, okay, we're doing this project. What kind of advice do you guys have, and where you started, and kind of what other engine developers have to say about the topic?
That sounds really cool, actually. Keeping track of why you make decisions is definitely something that I wish I did more often. There are certain projects where I've been I really want to make sure I get some of these things correct. And on those, I always take meticulous notes on them. And other ones, I just don't for whatever reason. And you usually end up wishing that you did, because you're why did I think this was a good idea again? And it helps to be able to go back and know, because sometimes it wasn't a good decision, but it's interesting to know why you thought so. Other times you forget why it was a good decision, and then you go to change it, and only after a couple days of doing other stuff do you run into something you're oh, that's why I made right. Future self was dumber than past self in that sense. So yeah, I do think that's a very good practice to try.
Yeah, and we're very curious kind of to see how it works of being further down the line of how much we learn over just doing, because we only have about 3 months to build this game engine. So it's very simple in all forms.
Yeah.
But we just seeing how much progress of I bet by the end of the semester we'll kind of turn around and all that stuff we made at the beginning was just almost garbage compared to what we're doing near the end.
Yes, that's probably true. But I guess the other thing I would say is there's definitely a tendency to undervalue code that you have written that is working. A lot of times as programmers, it's very tempting, and you're not wrong, right, when you look back at code and go, wow, I could do so much better. But one of the things that's interesting about that I find anyway, is that a lot of times there are a bunch of things you did in there that you're forgetting are important and that work. And it's almost I tend to look at code in a little bit of more of a Darwinian sense these days than I used to, where it's code that can do something has a certain value to it that code that's in your head that is better doesn't have yet, right? And you, depending on how complex the code or the problem that you're tackling is, sometimes you can drastically undervalue those things that went right simply by virtue of the fact that the thing works. You know that they did. And so I often try to encourage people, especially sort of programmers with less experience, to sort of don't be too hard on your existing code if it works, because there's probably more to learn there than you think there is, or another way to say it was you did better than you think you did. I think there's a lot of talk about people, they say clean code, or is it elegant, or is it this sort of thing, and there's a tendency to discount it worked as a really important part. So always be a little bit proud of something that worked, and take more time than you might otherwise to appreciate why it worked, because there's often more there than people think there is. And then they go to do some high-minded redesign of it, and it turns out worse than the original version because they didn't spend time appreciating just what went right, separate thing, but.
Yeah, no, it's good. We're this whole Skype talk, we're just kind of trying to pull as much information like that out of you. So feel free to go on as much as you'd like.
Sure.
So kind of how we're thinking of doing this interview, as you saw in the questions, is kind of like a pre-interview where we kind of try to get to know you a little bit better with some kind of more basic questions, and then kind of go into an interview more focused on the technical details of game engines. Don't feel free you need to hold back or anything. We might not necessarily understand, but that's kind of the point of this.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess our first kind of simple question is, can you tell us a little bit about your background, your schooling, your hobbies, and stuff like that you find it interesting, that could be interesting for game engine development type work?
So I guess this answer is probably not going to be very interesting, so I'll try to keep it short. Essentially, I started programming very, very young compared to people probably from my generation, simply because a lot of people wouldn't have had access to very much that they could do to program, but my father happened to be a programmer, and that was somewhat more rare in the 1970s. I was born in 1976. So the number of people whose fathers or mothers in that day and age, actually, it was more common for females to be programmers as well, actually, I think, percentage-wise. There were just very few programmers at all, right?
Yeah.
And so the chances that you had a parent or, a relative or something who was a programmer, or even a neighbor, was low. And the chances that you had programming materials like a compiler or books that were about it, or someone you could ask, was also low. So it was pretty rare to learn as early as I did. I learned when I was about 7 years old. My dad taught me BASIC on DEC Rainbow Computer. And I just loved programming from then forward. And even before then, I used to love typing on a computer, just the act of typing. So I really never did anything else. I think I maybe gravitated towards programming game engines because it's a really interesting technical thing to do, and kids love games. So at an early age, you're tending, that's what you see most. I wouldn't have been naturally drawn to the simulation of thermodynamics that someone was doing at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory at that time. As interesting as the technical problem that may have been, a child is not aware or thinking of these things. Today with the internet, that may be very different. People may be getting exposure to lots of other things that a computer can do, and they might think more about that, but I wasn't. So what ended up happening is I worked on that sort of stuff just on my own at home on various different computers that we had, and I literally just never stopped. I didn't go to college or anything. I just ended up going into the game industry sort of right out of high school. And I never have really done anything other than game engine programming. Hobby-wise, I do think I've always been interested in sort of the artistic things that go along with game development. So hobby-wise, I do tend to look into and practice other things. I've learned to do 3D modeling and texturing, and I've learned to do sketching, concept sketching and that sort of stuff. And I learned to play piano. I took lessons as piano as a child, and that was very helpful to understand music stuff. So there's been a bunch of other things that I've done that help to understand and allow me to communicate with other people who work on other parts of the project in ways that are much better than I would have otherwise.
Yeah.
But I never really took seriously any other profession or occupation-oriented thing. I've never really had that experience. For all I know, I would like some other occupation better. I have no idea. What I would say is that the only interesting takeaway, I think, from any of that is just that I would say that learning to do other things, even if you don't intend to do them, is very useful from not only the fact that you can communicate more effectively with the other people who are going to be doing those things. So an engine programmer who knows how to do 3D modeling is kind of very valuable in a lot of ways on a team, because the modelers have no way of communicating with you other than in the language that they understand and about the tools that they understand. And if you literally just don't know all of like what goes into making a 3D model, if you don't know how to paint something in ZBrush, or you don't know how to like resurface something in 3D Studio or whatever, you don't have to be great at it, but just knowing what goes into that can be very nice, because it means that you can then understand exactly what they're going through on a daily basis and be more effective at helping them or understanding their complaints when they have them, or assisting them in getting their tools into a state that is better for them. And I feel like those things are very useful for engine programmers to have. If you don't like doing those things, it's not a bad thing. There's plenty of room for engine programmers who just want to focus on optimization. There's a whole suite of people who just do that. But if you do find yourself being more, I don't know if polymath is the word for it, but if you do find yourself wanting to have a broader experience, those things are helpful, and you will find those valuable as you sort of work on technology, even though you're not technically doing any of those other things.
Yeah. So kind of follow-up question to that is, do you find artists or like designers coming to engine developers and asking those questions, or is it more you as an engine developer kind of need to go out and see what other people are doing and communicate with them that way?
It's both. So one of the things that you'll find is that artists in particular, I think, are very boxed in their understanding of what a computer could be doing oftentimes. And this is because they have been sort of brutally treated by tools like Photoshop or any Autodesk product you might care to purchase. And so, they may have gone into art or computer art with sort of a more boundless imagination of what was possible, but they have been beaten down. I mean, you can pretty much expect that any artist has been beaten down. To the point where their ability to imagine what a tool could be doing for them is very limited, because they've constantly faced I don't want to say rejection, but they've been constantly faced with barriers to them ever realizing anything in their head they may have had, right? Mm-hmm. So anything inside that boundary, you can usually count on them to communicate to you. So if it's just a case of like, I think this thing should be working in Photoshop, but it's not, or we would like a way to be able to use this Photoshop feature, but your engine isn't supporting it, those are the kinds of things that an artist might bring up to you. Things that they have sort of been taught that the computer does not do, they don't know programming a lot of times and can't be expected to realize that that's just because Adobe doesn't do that, right? Like, it just, that thing doesn't exist. So anytime that you can observe an artist working, or spend time just looking at how they have to go about creating things or working with the tools that they use to make things, is very valuable, because you will see things that a programmer obviously knows could be fixed, but that an artist just may not realize can be fixed. And again, I think that's just because they are an artist, they think in art terms, and they have never had the ability to change the tool in any meaningful way a lot of times. Yeah. So they just think that what they have is what they have to live with. And they, especially the older the artist is, or the longer that they've worked in with computer stuff, the more they will just accept the reality of the tools, and you can no longer expect them to bring you any kind of pie-in-the-sky idea, even though that may have been something they would have thought of before they were sort of taught rigidly what is available to them. I don't know if that helps. Another way to say it would be artists are used to adapting to their medium. When someone gets a charcoal pencil, they know they have to use charcoal, and they learn to use that medium. So it's exactly the same with computers. After they adapt to the medium, they can no longer tell you what they wish they would have, because they've been trained out of it, essentially, most of the time.
Okay, yeah, that's a really interesting point of view on that. Actually, going back a little further to when you were saying you started programming at 7 and you were interested in games too, when you were around 7, were you making your first games, or were you just kind of experimenting, making like Hello World type programs?
Yeah, so when I was 7, both of those things are an accurate statement. So when I was 7, in BASIC, the BASIC language was very much what you might think of as on like an Apple II or something, if you've ever seen one of those old, in a history museum at this point or something. So I wanted to make a game, but not only was I not really capable of understanding a lot of the stuff that would have gone into anything that you would think of as a game today, but BASIC wasn't super capable of doing anything at any speed in those days anyway. I mean, even if you just wrote assembly language, you couldn't do things at very high speeds in those days for obvious reasons. So all I made for games were things that would basically print out like some text. Like imagine a text adventure where instead of actually, because I didn't know how to implement the back of a text adventure, it's more just like a multiple choice, right? So it would print out like a line of text and like be like, what do you want to do? And it would be like 1 or 2, and I would just hard code the results, right? So you can think of it kind of games that are sort of on the level of interactivity of today's game by, say, David Cage. Do you want to push the button to do the thing or not, right? Like, and that's all you get, right? So it was that without all of the fancy graphics was all I could do for obvious reasons. My brain was just not capable of understanding it all. No experience, and then the fact that computers are so slow too, right? So yeah, they were games, but
yeah. I think everyone's kind of first game.
Mm-hmm.
So then going off of that, when about would you say you started creating your first engine? Like about how old / like kind of around what were you thinking of building an engine for?
So the first engine that I would say that I attempted to build, I guess I would say that I did build it, is in 8th grade for a science fair project. I built this thing that was essentially I guess you could call it King's Quest without animation. Maybe a better example would be like a magnetic scrolls kind of a thing from the old days, where it had like a picture, and the picture could change based on the state of the world. So it wasn't like it was completely static. It could show you different pictures depending on like what room you would go to, or like if you opened a door, it would change the door from a closed version to an open version. But there was no real like animation in any real-time sense. Like you didn't see characters walking around, and there was really no spot animation. So, back pretty far in sort of the text adventure. And what you would do is you'd type in a line of text, and it would execute it. So open door, closed door, north, those sorts of things.
Gotcha.
You could do. And it, whether or not you want to call it a game engine as opposed to just a game and an engine that were sort of together, I don't know, but it was designed sort of to be an engine, so there were like separate pieces in a sense. And that was the first one that I really did. And obviously it wasn't good, but it existed, which I suppose is something.
Definitely. So kind of moving a lot forward in time now to Handmade Hero. So as we were kind of building up for this project, we were checking out a lot of your videos, and you're at like 470 now. So it's
something like that.
Something going on as long as this. How do you ever refer to any of your past streams, or and like how do you keep track of things going on with such a long project by yourself?
So I think there's a couple things to appreciate about Handmade Hero, which is that the development streams are very short. They're an hour to 2 hours. There's only once or twice we've done like a marathon where I did 4 hours, So 477 or whatever we're at now, let's just say 500. 500 hours or even 1,000 hours of development is really not very long for a 42-year-old programmer. That's, a couple months of development time if I was working full time. And so I think that it's easy to think, well, this is so many episodes because if you were just coming at them to watch them, and you were going to I'm going to sit down and watch Handmade Hero, the whole thing. It's like, oh my God, right?
Yeah.
But it's really not very much programming. Like, if you think about how much programming each of you has already done in your life, it's probably pretty similar. I mean, you spend a lot of time programming if you're a programmer, and the amount of time it would take you to get to 500 or 1,000 hours of programming isn't really that much, you know? And if you haven't already hit that now, you'll probably hit it before you graduate from whatever program you're in now. But, you know, even if you don't do that, your first year of full-time work, you'll definitely hit it, right? So I don't know how much programming you guys have done, but you've either already done it or will soon do it. And so it's easy for people to overestimate the difficulty of keeping track, because I get that question a lot. And I think it's just because people don't realize it's bigger. It sounds bigger than it is. It's actually a very small engine. It's under 100,000 lines of code. Every time I'm programming, I'm explaining at the same time. There are entire episodes that are nothing but whiteboard, essentially, or blackboard in this case, discussions. And so the amount that I actually have to keep in my head on Handmade Hero is very small. But if you watch some series, I'm like, I will say on a day, I don't really remember how we did X. Like, you can find episodes where I've said that. And what hopefully you can see is what I then do is I just go into a very straightforward process that I always just assume that if I wrote code competently in the first place, a cursory inspection of it later should reveal to me how I decided to do things. It won't necessarily reveal why, because I may not have encoded anything. I tend to not comment code until it's done, because I find that the comments end up being out of date and end up being counterproductive. I write, it's actually describing the thing that was before the latest one, you know, and it's actually worse than having no comment. And so I think that part of developing a good programming style, it has a lot less to do with things that people normally focus on, which are like these rules. You know, did I overload operator equals to prevent a copy? They focus on all of these rules that they really have never even really tested or proven in production really save you any time. And they ignore like the most important things, which in my opinion are, how easy is it for me to read my own code later and know exactly what it does, right? I mean, and that's like one of the most important things you can do. And so that's really, I think, what keeps Handmade Hero so flexible and easy for me to not have to worry when I come back to it on a weekend to start doing a stream, is I just know that's part of being a competent programmer, is writing code in a way that doesn't require me to keep it all in my head. I can easily go look at the function names and I just know what they do. And this is doubly easy if I'm the programmer, because I know what assumptions I make. And if I just always make those same assumptions, then I know I don't have to investigate those things further, you know? I know I'm not going to call new in the middle of a thing because I never do that, right? So a lot of things like that, if you develop a programming style that you find is effective, simply leaning on that style in your own code will allow you to keep it flexible, keep it easy to remember, and recall when you do forget. So I think those are the two aspects. One of them is about becoming a good programmer in a sense, which is making sure that your style actually pays real benefits and not hypothetical sort of textbook unproven things. But the other one is just, I think people overstate the difficulty of the Handmade Hero thing. It's not that hard when the code is that small, you know? Try doing that on the Unreal Engine code base, right? I mean, I would not be coming back to it and going like, oh, and I'll just do this. I'd be like, what is going on here? Like, let me step through it in the debugger for 6 hours before I really know, you know, so.
Yeah. And you said something interesting there where you were talking a little about your own personal kind of standard and conventions. So when you're on a team of people who maybe have different kind of things that they lean on, do you suggest that everyone you start recognizing people's styles, or do you try to force people into conforming into one style, which might get them uncomfortable with something?
Yes,
so
I know exactly what you're asking, and it's an excellent question. And I think honestly, I think there is no good answer to it. I'll say a few things about it, but I guess what I would say is that is probably one of the biggest problems in programming today. If you imagine that programming, in a sense, is a two-part process, because I think it is. One is, and they're not separate processes, but there's two, sort of things that are going on at any time.
Yeah.
One is coming up with a language, and the other is speaking in that language. So we talk about having a programming language, but we really don't have the programming language that we use. What we have when we talk about a programming language is a building block for the language that we will use. It should probably be called a programming alphabet, if we're honest, or a programming phonemes. Because usually what happens, and in any game engine this definitely happens, is that first you take the language that you have, like C++, and you build your own language on top of it, which is sort of a functional language of core things that everyone will talk about. How is the memory managed, and how do we implement sort of the render pipeline, and how do we pass things back and forth? What is the job control story? All these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Those things form a secondary language, and it's in some sense a very recursive process. You could think of it as making lots of languages on top of each other, and some programming projects are so poorly thought through that there's like languages on top of languages on top of languages in some sense, right? And so if you think of each programmer as sort of having their own ideal language that is what they would like to see that substrate that's right on top of the regular language that they all had to conform to,
Yeah.
they're all fluent in that, presumably, their own one. So when you bring two programmers together, you essentially have a problem where it's like, hey, you and I should write this book, but you speak French and I speak Spanish, right? And it's like, okay, well, how do we come together to write this book that's, still in a Latin style typography, but it's neither of our languages, and we get, right? And so I think that the jury is still out. I might even say that the appellees and the plaintiffs and defendants are still out on what the right way to do that is. There's certainly Procrustean approaches that are like, here at company X, we demand everyone have this many tabs in their thing, and every class looks like this, and there's a file for every blah. There's people who specify everything, right? And it's like everyone must conform. There's other places that are just like, do whatever you want, and we'll figure it out at the boundary, right? We'll do something. And everything in between. And I think that we don't know the answers to what's right about that, and I would be absolutely lying if I said I thought I had a good solution to it. What I can say is that there is no question in my mind that there is a difference in speed, efficacy, and quality of code that comes from shifting from your native language into another one. So shifting from your native programming style into somebody else's costs you. And you have to balance that cost against the fact that when we work together, we can get more done. If we have more competent programmers on a project, assuming each of them is capable of writing something useful for this project, we can get more done, up to a certain point. Obviously, there's communication costs that might kill you at some point, but 4 or 5 people on a project should be able to get more done than one person on a project. My experience with working on The Witness was definitely that I took a pretty massive productivity hit working in that code base compared to my own. And there's nothing you can do about that. I do build some of my own language in there. Like I put some of my own tools in there as over time so that I can be effective, but it's on an on-demand basis. And there's an entire article I wrote about a time when I had a bug that I had only because I made a wrong assumption about the math library, right? And that's a perfect, like, the reason that me and John Blow are both able to write certain types of code quickly is because we both make assumptions about what our math library does. And if you couldn't make those assumptions, if I had to literally read the code for cross product or something every time to figure out whether it was right-handed or left-handed, I would be much slower, I'd have way more bugs, right, blah, blah, blah. And so it's really hard to overstate just how important that is. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily realize it because if you've never programmed by yourself on your own engine at a time when you were a fairly mature programmer, if the only time you ever did that was like in your basement or whatever, right? and you've never done that after you've had a lot of experience and are more self-confident and have more of an opinion about what should be going on, you may not realize how fast you actually are when everything is done the way you expect, because you've only ever done it at Valve or something where everything works maybe a little bit differently than how you would want it to, right, or something.
Yeah.
And so it is a very important thing to be aware of. I don't have an answer, but it's important to understand.
All right. Yeah, thank you. So then kind of going off of that, you mentioned a little bit about you working on the witness and kind of adding your own layer into there. Has there been like a hack per se that you've done recently or seen recently that you thought was either really unique or kind of interesting to do, or like way around the code base or something like that?
A hack? Can you be more specific? What does that mean, a hack?
So kind of going off of like not necessarily following the rules that are kind of laid out by like the other person programming it, or so typically probably not on like something like Handmade Hero, but maybe like when you were working with someone else's code.
So I may not be understanding the question correctly, but if I'll restate it to see if I am. So
Okay.
what you're saying is that if you are programming in a code base that you did not yourself design,
Yeah.
is there anything that I can think of that's a particularly interesting thing that's done in that code base that goes against the grain of the code base, but that was interesting? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So I guess what I would say is that I would probably never consider that to be a particularly gratifying experience. So no, that to me is just always a sign that there is a problem with whatever the code base is, because generally speaking, if I have to do something that I feel is antithetical to how the code base is architected or works in order to get something to work properly, then fundamentally speaking, that's really just more of a statement about the poor quality of the underlying thing and not a statement about something good about what I did. So if I, to put it in other terms, I might say, so, have I ever felt particularly psyched about something I accomplished when programming on Microsoft Windows? And the answer is no. I've just been aggravated the entire time that it was so annoying that I had to go to these Herculean lengths. And maybe, I could look back on it and warp it into a sense of pride that I was good enough to make this thing that worked around a really bad system. But I guess at this point anyway in my life, I don't have a pride about that. I just feel bad. I just feel like it was a waste of my time, and it's going to be a waste of everyone else's time, and it's just a shame that stuff like that's still around and never seems to get fixed. I'm sorry to answer that question with a downer, but...
No, it's fine. But yeah, so going off of kind of your answer of that, when you notice something that you feel like you're doing something like that, unlike you're working with other people, is it typically kind of go to address the person, or do you kind of try to dig down into what they've done to figure out why it's like this? Just kind of curious about your thought on that.
Yeah. Okay. So I definitely think I understand that question. So I guess what I would say is I would not take my advice or perspective on anything that has to do with that. So I don't like working with people on code. I like working with people on other things. I love working with artists and so on. I don't like working with other people on code because I don't care to do exactly what you're saying. I just want things to be done well, and if they are done well, I don't mind using whatever paradigm the person who did them well has. If they are not done well, then I'm just aggravated, and I don't really want to go have a conversation with that person about it. That's not to say that I'm not trying to belittle that. I think working on teams and learning team communication and how to work effectively on a team is something that's a great thing for people who want to work on teams. Mm-hmm. But the reality of programming is that, everyone has their own preference. And one of the reasons I like programming is that there's a lot of things I can do and I can earn a living not having to communicate with people about what I'm doing. I can just do it the way I want and get it right. So
Okay.
I would say most of the time my preference for working on things is I work on my thing, you work on your thing, we communicate about those things, but not about the code. And I don't care how you did it, and I don't want to butt in on how you were doing it. And to the extent that I can, I just want those things walled off so that your code doesn't affect mine and mine doesn't affect yours, so we really just don't have to worry about it.
Yeah.
That said, I appreciate how it is not always possible to put yourself in that position, especially if you're working at a larger company or on a very large project. And that is just why I don't work on those things.
Okay. And so kind of continuing off that, so having like fans and backers to Handmade Hero, have you felt like that's, and the people watching you as well, do you feel like that ever influences the way you do things or kind of changes your thought process about any of the things that you're doing on the engine? Or is it more they're just kind of there along with the journey with you?
It's the latter in terms emotionally, I guess I would say, meaning that I don't think of people who buy Handmade Hero as backers. It's just a pre-order for a game. You get the source code if you want it. It's not a Kickstarter. I don't require a certain amount of money to do it. I'm doing it whether no one ever bought it or not. So I don't really think of them as backers. If they were backers in the traditional sense of the term, meaning I had promised some specific set of deliverables or something that they were funding to make happen, I might consider things in that way. But since it's not that, I really don't think of it that way. Handmade Hero is the thing I wanted to do. I wanted to have video of a programmer making an entire game from scratch so we could go back and look and see, like, where do things get done, how do they happen, right, and all that sort of thing, and you could jump around in it and all that sort of stuff. I just wanted to have that.
Yeah.
That said, it is unquestionably true that having people watch on the stream affects the series, and the reason for that is twofold. One is that there are a surprising number of experts who show up to the stream from time to time.
Yeah.
And those experts know things I don't know. So, for example, someone might be more of a platform expert on a particular aspect of OpenGL or something than I am, and they'll tell me on the stream. So there's something that I might have programmed worse, and they'll pop up and say, oh, you can do this, or that's not supported on this card, but if you do this, it is, right? Those are things that are just better now. It's like having a free code review that I don't have to really spend any time on, right? It's just happening. I don't even have to wait. It's just happening over the internet with thousands of eyes waiting to point out something that I could have done better. And that's kind of a cool free resource. It definitely means that there's sections of the Handmade Hero code that did things right that would have done them wrong. Or if right and wrong is maybe the wrong term, but did things better than the way I would have written them. Or did write them and then corrected.
Yeah.
Similarly, there's been times when people have pointed out resources I was unaware of. The last time I had really done any x64 assembly language work, well, not assembly language, but intrinsics work, I didn't know about IACA, the Intel code analyzer, because it didn't exist. And so when I was on the stream, I was like, I really wish that I didn't have to count all the instructions, and that there was a way to just, a compiler should just tell me what they are. And, I think it was Fabian who was just like, there is, you can go download IACA and use it. And I was like, oh my God. And that tool's awesome, right? It's exactly the tool I wanted. And who knows how long it would have taken me to find out that tool existed if he hadn't randomly been watching the stream and told me,
Yeah.
So it's definitely paid dividends having the stream that have nothing to do with the original stated purpose of the stream. Just having experts in various domains, especially ones that I am not an expert in, has been helpful. Even in my knowing about IACA helps me in my own programming day job, right? So that's been great.
Yeah.
It's been really good.
And kind of going on the other side of you of the people following along kind of in the same boat as us of learning how to do things. With regards to Handmade Hero, do you think people can use Handmade Hero as like a sole source of learning, kind of watching from the first to following you kind of through it? Or do you think it's a really good use of like watching this and doing some other things and kind of doing your own thing all at the same time? Because like you said, you have the zip files available at the end of the days and stuff like that.
That's a really tough question. So I will start by saying that the goal of Handmade Hero was to do it the way that I'm doing it, because I wanted to have that complete record. And it was designed to be there because I thought there were things people would learn by watching an engine programmer just do what they do, rather than them telling them the result they ended up with. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been really good at that, because I've had many people actually tell me that that was a big breakthrough for them. They were like, just seeing what you actually do totally makes me feel more comfortable about doing how to go about this, right?
Yeah.
And so that, I think, was the only thing I was trying to really do with Handmade Hero. So that's the thing that I think is important to take away from the series and what I hope people get out of it. Everything else, I have no idea, because the goal wasn't to teach people 3D math. I just do that as a course to series because I wanted people to see explanations of those things.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a good way to learn it. I don't know what other things would be valuable. So I think I'm not really sure. Probably the answer is, one answer is, if I was going to make a course for people to learn 3D math for engines, let's say, it wouldn't look like Handmade Hero.
Yeah.
Right? So that's definitely true. Whether that means there's other resources available right now that are better than Handmade Hero, I don't know, but I know that Handmade Hero isn't the best we can do. I can say that for sure, because if I made one, I wouldn't make it like this. And I'm the one making Handmade Hero, right? So I'm already saying it's not the best for that, right?
Yeah.
So I guess that's really all I can say about that part of it. The other part that I would say is, just to focus on the part you said about using it as a sole resource, I don't think you ever want to use any one programmer's ideas or code as your sole resource. And the reason for that is because it's assuming everyone's brain works a little differently, and that the most efficient way to think through a problem is not the same for everybody.
Yeah.
Then unless your brain literally works exactly the same way that mine does, and there may be some people out there who it does, right? But it's only going to be some people. Then the chances that all the things you might want to know about programming are encompassed in what I have to say is zero. There's going to be very valuable approaches and things that I not only might not be aware of, but even if I am aware of them, might just not like and not think are good, that you will think are good and that are effective for you.
Okay.
So I think it's important to be exposed to multiple different programming styles, so that you, and even more so than that, I think it's important for a programmer's brain to be able to distinguish between those styles in a concrete way, because that's the way you can find the programming styles that work for you. And I think, like, when I found myself, I'd probably say when I was like 23, 24 maybe. I don't know how old I was at the time. About the same time as I found myself actually thinking, how do I figure out what elements of programming style are good and bad? For my, like, I am not taking anyone's opinion. I don't care what people write in these books. I've realized that they don't really know what they're talking about all the time. I want to come up with ways I can evaluate this stuff for real, and I want to see how it works when I do it. About that time was when I felt like I became a much better programmer. Like, it was you always feel like you're getting better, but that was a really big divide. And I think that it's important for programmers to try to cross that divide for themselves. And they're not going to cross it by watching a series like mine and assuming that everything I do is right. Because even if everything I did was right for them, they still haven't developed the critical faculties necessary to know why. And that's a problem. So not only is that a problem, but I also suspect that for most programmers, not everything I do in the way I do it will be the way that they should do it, because they will find different techniques are better for them.
Okay. All right. So we're going gonna kind of now move on more to the interviewee side, I guess, things. So we have a few questions that part of our project is also, as we said, to talk to professionals. We're gonna edit and then transcribe these so that way other people can kind of learn from them. Because we think that blogs are a really good way to kind of learn from, because that's how we're doing a lot of our learning. And so, as I was saying, we're trying to help novice engine programmers. And so when you first started programming like larger scale game engines, what was like the most confusing part, or maybe even not even large scale, but when you first started programming game engines, what was kind of the largest confusion that you might have had approaching those?
So this is a very intricate question. And I'm not sure how I'm going to answer it in a way that can be concisely transcribed and useful.
Okay.
Let me say a few things about the question, and then maybe you could ask a follow-up question that will get at the heart of what you want to know, and then transcribe that.
All right, perfect.
Okay. So there are two fundamental problems that I think are involved in game engine development that set it apart from a lot of other types of development. The first one is that it is not a statable problem in any way. 99% of everything that programming does in the past or today looks a lot like standard in, standard out, right? You can phrase it as, here are a set of inputs and here are the set of outputs that come out of it. So most of the things that programmers are used to thinking about, and the way that they're used to thinking about them is, I'm working on deep learning. Here's a set of input images and a set of output tuned neural net parameters. How do I make the best translation between these two things, right? I'm a natural language processing person. Here's all the corpus I want in, and here are the noun tags I want out, or the sentence tags I want, right? And so I think one of the biggest challenges for an early game engine programmer is making the leap from input-output thinking to this amorphous, systemic, tons of things in crazy states come together in this weird way to produce an alternate reality that you can experience, right? And it's very confusing how that happens at first, because even though you're not necessarily aware of it, everything you've ever done prior to that looks a lot more like this input-output phrasing, right?
Yeah.
So one of the really good things that you can do at first, right, is to try to figure out the sort of what I want to call the I don't know, the core loop, the golden loop, the golden differentiator of a simulation, which is like a flight simulator, a game, the things that have this, right, is they look like this real-time loop of, I have a set of entity states, right? I go through a simulation to change the states of these things. That's a certain process. I then go through a way of presenting those things, and then I return to the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Just getting yourself comfortable with that, and that everything that you build has to build out of that, is just the first big step. It's not input-output anymore. It doesn't look like a web program. It doesn't look like a neural network. It doesn't look like a parser. It doesn't look like a server. It doesn't look like any of these things. It looks like that. Hopefully a lot of people are able to make that leap without too much trouble, but it's just worth noting that's the first big thing you've got to hit. So figure out how to do that. Make a very simple thing that has those properties and get it working. Understand that everything from now on will have that structure, not the other one, right?
Yeah.
Okay. The other thing is the complexity explosion, right? So again, because it's not input to output, where you have this very clean sort of thing, you have all of these systems that are all happening at the same time. They all interact. They all overlay on top of each other. The physics and the rendering and the blah, this, that, and the other thing. Game design entities, scripting, all of this stuff comes together. You really need to be able to do discoverable architecture in order to do these things correctly. And most people are just not familiar with that process. And what I mean by that is I've called it compression-oriented programming in the past. What I mean is the technique of writing something in the simplest way possible. I think this is Jonathan Blow's term that he uses often. He says, like, write something the simplest way possible. Just whatever's obvious to you. Don't even think about the rest of the game engine. I just need to do this one thing. Think about it more like the standard in, standard out that we're all used to. How do I just phrase it, just get the input and the output to do the thing I need to do just in isolation from anything else? No code design, no cleanliness, no nothing, just no abstract thoughts, just concrete. You need to be able to do that, clear everything from your head and just do that, and then pull that out into the architecture. And one of the biggest mistakes that I think even experienced game programmers will often make is they go the other direction. They try to start with the architecture and drill down to the thing they want to do. And I have never, ever in my entire life seen a good result from that. It almost always has to be refactored at the end, because when you start from a conception of how something will plug together, you don't see all the details. You don't know all the things that you're really going to have to do when you go to solve the problem. So you always forget some. Whereas if you just implement the real thing first and then pull it up into the architecture, fit it in, you almost always end up with better results. So I like to think about those problems, and this gets away from your question a little bit, so I apologize, but I like to think about those almost, there's a thing called boundary value problems in mathematics, right?
Yeah.
And there's different ways of solving them. There's like shooting methods. I start here, I see where I end up. There's solving backwards where I try to see what I could hit from, right? Building up a skill set of how you work on code that allows you to work from either side of the problem ends up being really valuable in this case. Because, like I said, you usually want to start with the solution, loft it up into the architecture, but in addition to part of that process, when you get to a certain level of that lofting, you want to think from the other side down as well. You want to go, what should a good API for this look like? What are some things I maybe didn't think about when I was implementing it that I should maybe change that wouldn't break the algorithm, but that would let it work better with this integration? So it's kind of like this, you almost want a ping-ponging process where you start at the solution, work backwards a little, go to the architecture side, work forwards a little, come back, and it's that the best programmers at doing this sort of thing are able to come at it and make it fit really nicely at the end, so both sides can be happy.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that actually did answer the question that we were looking for.
Okay,
So,
all right.
That was, it worked out.
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to Alan Webster for that, by the way. He works at Rad Game Tools now, but I've talked about those two things separately, and I never really talked about them together for some reason. And he actually asked me a question. He's like, I've heard you say two totally separate things. I've heard you say start from the solution and work backwards to integrate. And I've heard you say always write the usage code first. Well, which one is it? And I'm like, you're totally right. Like, it's like, it's that you do the first thing I said until you have the thing correct and working and integrated. Then you work forwards and go, how should I talk to this thing? What are the changes I need to make? And why I never connected those two in my brain, I don't know, but I give him full credit for that realization that you should always talk about them together, because talking about them separately doesn't help anybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see talking about them separately could cause like a little confusion after hearing the second one or something.
Even
like
in
that.
my own brain, it's clear that I was doing something intuitively that I'd never internalized and probably was therefore forgetting to do sometimes when I should have done it. So I'm very thankful for him for having like identified that rather important gap.
All right. So we've been reading through some of the Handmade Hero forums, and we came across one where you were kind of like restating the goal, or talking about who this Handmade Hero was actually for. And I think one of the lines you were saying is that it's not about making a game, but it's about I think you said inspiring engine programmers or something along those lines.
Yes.
And you said there's a shortage of people who are trying to be engine programmers.
Yes.
Why do you think that there's a shortage of people trying to get into the engine programming space versus like the other game spaces?
So, I don't really want to do too much data-free analysis on this, I guess is what I would say, because it's tempting to provide answers. Well, if you ever read the newspaper, you will know that it's very common for people to like to provide answers to things that they obviously just don't know what they're talking about, right? And have no data to support them. So this is a question that sort of demands, if it wants to be answered correctly, demands a data answer, which is, are there really a shortage of engine programmers? And if there are, why, right? What's the reason for it? I don't pretend to know the answer to either of those questions. What I can tell you is that if today you told me I needed to staff up a 10-person engine team, which is a modest engine team, I would have almost no idea where to get 8 of those people, right? And the 2 that I maybe do know where to get, I'd have to hire from some other team, right? And now that team has to hire 2 engine programmers, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm strictly talking about this from a personal experience in the game industry. It is an anecdote, not a statistic, where I say that I just don't find that people know where to hire engine programmers. And I mean, I know so many people I know plenty of people who've hired people who they really don't think are even that good at engine programming, but who were definitely the best they could get. I mean, they could not have gotten better engine programmers, but they wished they could have, right? And similarly, I know plenty of people who would hire another engine programmer right now if they could find one, but there's no one who meets their cutoff, right? And so some of that is just like, well, if especially on smaller teams, you can't afford to hire lots of junior people, maybe. So maybe there's some raw talent out there just needs to be developed, and again, data-wise, I don't want to make claims about this that I can't substantiate because I don't have the data. But in terms of real experts on this, it's just very hard to find. And I can't offer you a reason for that, but I just assume that the reason is that even in today's day and age where a lot of people license engines, the bottom line is even something as simple as using Unity kind of requires you to understand 3D math at a pretty decent level if you're not going to ship one of these games with all these like obvious bugs in it, right? And so it's a hard profession. It demands that you know a lot of things. It's not for the faint of heart. It requires a lot of expertise, a lot of time spent learning. Even to just be a competent engine side programmer, like I'm going to modify Unreal Engine in a small way. I'm going to modify Unreal in a small way. I'm going to make a plugin that does something I need to do. Or even I'm just going to competently program a motion controller in Unreal or something.
Yeah.
These are just skills that people just don't seem to have in abundance. And so, even today when it's like, well, you can just go get an engine so you don't need to build it from scratch, we still haven't, it's just, we have not gotten to the point where we have enough talent versus, and talent's the wrong word, expertise really. We don't have enough expertise versus how much we could be using to make games better. Right? Okay.
Yeah, no, sorry, I wasn't trying to make you pull any data. I was just kind of curious where you're coming from with that.
Yes, that's just a personal experience, and it's I suspect if you talked to other people in the game industry, they would have similar opinions about how hard it is to find good engine programmers. And I don't want to put words in their mouth, so you should ask them. But it's not the kind of thing that you can just go find someone to do. And I think we're getting better at pipelines for finding artists. It is much easier to find a highly qualified artist today than it was 10 years ago, thanks to social media, thanks to online tutorials, education about what goes into making a game asset, probably thanks to even school curricula that was not around in those days. What I have not seen change is the number of engine programmers. The last 3 engine programmer hires I know about or was in any way involved with, all came from Handmade Hero. If it wasn't for Handmade Hero, never would have found him. And who knows if they even would have done it. Maybe they would have done something else. I don't even know. So, you know, that was really, again, the reason for Handmade Hero was exactly what I just said. It's in that intro sort of fluffy video I did there. It's right. It's like, it says, I believe this way of life is worth preserving. It's talking specifically about a practice and a discipline and a mental model. It's not, I want to show you how to make a game. Never said that, right? I said this way of life, specifically this, and I meant that. Like, I don't mean what's the easiest way to make a game, what's the most cost-effective way. I don't care at all about that, and I feel like that's something that's covered well enough elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So then, talking a little bit, so you're making Handmade Hero, and you've obviously made engines before Handmade Hero. Is there certain aspects when you, because I was listening to one of your videos and you're saying you've made the platform layer like 15 times and you kind of know how you like it now. But is there certain things like that you kind of always just pull in from each project, or do you ever try to like say, oh, I've done this 10 times before, I'm going to try it this new way to keep exploring, or are there just tried and true systems that you kind of follow along with?
So I guess I can't really answer the question because I am only 42 years old and not wise enough to know yet.
Okay.
Maybe when I'm 80, I'll be able to tell you if I had a piece of code that was worth reusing. Here's a couple things I can say along those lines. For the very first time on 1935, which is the main project I'm working on now, for the very first time, I decided that I never want to write a platform layer or standard library again. I'm like, I'm just going to do this one final, and I'm going to move on. I'm just going to make that statement. So I actually, on this project, and this is a very long project for me, it's you know, I'm expecting, honestly, this project is probably a 5-year project, which is a long time. For one programmer, it's not that much. I mean, 5 programmer years, whatever you want to call those.
Yeah.
Whatever the Mythical Man month would want to call that. In you know, I don't know if you guys know the Brooks book, The Mythical Man Month. It was a classic of old. Yeah, it's about IBM 360. Don't worry, no, none of you were alive. For the first time on this project, I decided to do that. I felt like I was ready to do that. And I tried very hard to do that. Whether it succeeds or not, I'm not sure. But what I will say is I took an approach that was slightly different from approaches I had taken before. And I did, to bring it back to the beginning of our session today, I did exactly what you were saying. So I have a file, and in it, every time there is a question about what I'm going to do in the code base, I document exactly why I thought there was a question. So why did I think that the answer to how this should work is not obvious? I discuss the solutions that I've tried, and I select one of them and say why I ended up selecting that one out of the ones that I tried. So there is literally, for the first time on any product that I've ever done, a 100% complete documentation of why every last thing works exactly the way it does, right?
Yeah.
And so I am trying to do that on this project, and we'll see how it works out. Prior to this project, I've never really felt like that was something that I wanted to do, because I've always felt like there was probably room to grow each time.
Yeah.
And that was usually because I never sat down and said, let me think all these things through. Because a lot of times you do a platform layer, you just do it, right? And this time I approached it with the other angle. So we'll see how that goes, but that's definitely, I think, even for myself, who advocates a very limber style of programming where I don't think you should really calcify or do a lot of upfront design sorts of things. Even if I want something to be the be-all, end-all, this is the one we're going to use forever, I do want to spend up more time recording and justifying decisions. I don't do them from the top down like a UML diagram disaster situation or anything like this. But I do feel that a higher level of rigor is necessary. And what I try to do in this situation is sort of play the devil's advocate, as if I had more than one program on the project, come at it from different angles. Can I justify it from a speed perspective? Can I justify it from an ease of use perspective? Can I justify it from a future compatibility with possible hardware directions, that sort of thing?
Okay.
And so we'll see. Ask me in 10 years if it worked.
All right. So kind of going off of the last question a little bit more of when Handmade Hero is done, or like your engines in the past are done, specifically talking about Handmade Hero, when it's done, do you expect other people to kind of use Handmade Hero to make games or do anything with, or is it purely for the kind of like the process of watching it? I know we've kind of gone over this a little bit, but
the latter. It is designed to be a standalone project that shows all of the parts that you would have to do to put together a game that you could release on Steam where you didn't use anyone else's code to make it. That's the entire goal of it. Doesn't have any ancillary goal. It's not designed for people to use for some other purpose or anything like this. That said, two things. One, I would like, when the project is finished, to essentially do an audit, if you will, of the code base, go through it all, and I would like to point out, because I know there will be many, because this is a very limited time project. The total number of hours that we spent on Handmade Hero is less than a year of programming time. So lots of stuff in it is very rough, right?
Yeah.
I like to do an audit, find all of the places where I think that roughness really shows, and write up exercises that programmers can go and take the Handmade Hero code base and fix something I didn't have time to do right. And I just say, like, this piece of code should be able to be better in these N ways. Pick one of those N ways and fix it. That's your homework assignment, right?
Yeah.
Because I think that would be really good for engine programmers to start within an engine that's made a bunch of decisions, whether they're right or wrong. You've got to live with them, because that's going to be your job when you're first starting out, probably. Here's the Unreal Engine. It does 50 different things wrong. You can't change those. They're baked into the architecture. It would be a massive change to fix them or whatever. So you got to live with them. How do you make these improvements, or how do you make this one part better, living with those constraints? So the Handmade Hero will be no different. Here's a bunch of things it does wrong. Here's one thing we would like to improve. You have to take it as a whole and just make that one improvement. So I would like the code base to serve as that in the future. Yeah. And I think it can serve as that pretty easily. The second thing I'd say is, in terms of expecting people to use it, now I kind of do expect people to use it to make other games, because I've had many people use it for other games already. I've had multiple people write to me and ask, is it okay if we use this for our game? And I've always said the same thing, just make sure it doesn't conflict with Handmade Hero and you're fine. I've had people already release games who did them for like game jams and stuff, who use the Handmade Hero codebase, so there's games already shipping that are on the Handmade Hero codebase. So okay. I guess if that portends anything, the answer is yes, people will use it. However, that was never my intention.
Gotcha. So moving on to, so while we were doing a little more research about you, we all read your piece on Walk Monster.
Okay.
I thought it was a really interesting tool, but towards the bottom, we like where you were talking about your like still open questions while you're writing it, of like, oh, you could add this feature, and this feature. At what point does investing into a test system like this become a net loss versus, or like spending too much time investing in a tool versus just using the tool for what it was originally made to do?
I suppose what I would say about that is that although as programmers gain more experience, if they are a talented and hardworking programmer, they will gain a certain amount of what I would call taste. I think I might want to attribute that term to Jeff Roberts, the person who founded Rad Game Tools and wrote the video codec that is used in every game that's ever shipped in the history of time. He, I think, used that term, taste, and I still use it, which is to say the things about decision-making that we probably cannot now, possibly ever, but at least not now, boil down into a rigorous science or anything of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect, as a program gains more experience, and if they are good and if they're conscientious, they can gain more taste about how to make a decision like the one you've stated.
Okay.
I think it was probably completely implausible for anyone to be able to give advice on how to make that decision. You either have enough experience to read the tea leaves to know, and you're a conscious enough programmer to make a good decision, or do the tests necessary to make that decision, or you're not, and I don't think someone can really help you gain that early. Not yet anyway. Maybe we'll learn something in the future. What I would say is that people almost categorically undervalue visualization. So if you were going to err on the side, if you can't decide whether it's good or bad to make a visualization, you're on the fence, make the visualization. That's about the only advice I can give. The chances that it will be not useful compared to its cost are almost zero. If you get to a point where you're pretty sure that you don't need any more visualization, then you can stop. But if you're on that fence, if you're like, this could help us, it might not, I'm not sure, go visualization. That's about the only piece of concrete advice I think I could give.
Yeah. Kind of going off that too, so I'm just curious on how the tool, so after you kind of did all the visualization, did you have to kind of fly through the map and try to figure out, there's this red circle here because there's like a leftover collision box or something like that, or did you kind of have something that would pop up in populated text file or something like that?
I'll answer that question briefly because I think it's Thursday, I'm giving a talk at the Busan Indie Connect conference where I will show demos of all of the tools we developed for walk checking and processing in the witness.
Okay.
They are drastically more advanced than the ones that I wrote about in the Walk Monster piece, and Walk Monster, in fact, was never used on the witness. We replaced it with things that are many times better than it. So it was really more of an exercise, Walk Monster was, of determining that we had a problem and that we had a serious problem. But the solution to that problem was actually much more involved and went in a different direction. So I guess what I would say is all of the problems that Walk Monster was designed to prevent, we ended up either preventing systemically in ways that they literally could not happen, or developed better visualization tools for that are much better than Walk Monster, and you'll see those on Thursday. They've told me that it will be recorded, but it doesn't matter. I'll post a recording of it either way. So presumably they'll either be the official recording or I'll post one, and you can. That'll probably be 2 weeks or something.
Okay. Awesome.
And you can link to that in the write-up if you want. So yeah.
All right. Perfect. So one of our kind of last questions about Handmade Hero is. Say you lost everything and you had to start from square one again. Is there anything that immediately comes to mind of like, I do this section differently or approach things differently?
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously there are, but that's because of the point of Handmade Hero, which is to say that the whole reason for recording the process was I wanted people to see me go down a few avenues before picking the one I wanted, or to see how a amorphous unstructured piece of code resolves into a structured one. So for example, fairly recently, one thing we did over the past 3 weeks, in fact, was we made the renderer standalone in a DLL that now anyone can use to make a renderer that does all the things that Handmade Heroes does. So the depth peeling and like stuff for sprites and the camera code, all that stuff is kind of in a separate library now. So if you wanted to just make a game that has an instant 3D hybrid sprite block renderer, you just have one, right?
Yeah.
Those are exactly what I wanted people to see in Handmade Hero. So if I lost the whole thing, I almost would say I would start a different project, because if I was going into Handmade Hero with the knowledge of how everything worked out, which I now know, it would totally ruin the entire point of the series. Watching me type in code I already know how to do is worthless. That's what a blog's for, right? Or a GitHub repo. Here's how to do it. We're done, right? So the whole point of the series was to show that. So on Handmade Hero, it was critical that I not have a solution in mind when I started for at least some of the major parts of the project. Hope preferably all.
All right. And then question about making builds. Making a build of the game can be kind of when I say builds, either like making the engine a DLL or kind of compiling the game with the engine kind of together. Kind of doing that process can be a little bit of a hurdle or kind of something unknown, at least from our point of view. And so when you're doing something like that, is there any good advice that you have to start it like early and keep it going on, or is it what advice do you have on creating builds early and like keeping them going rather than breaking type deal?
So I might understand the question, but I might not. So
Okay.
If I may ask some clarifying questions.
Yeah.
So if you were to substitute into that question, rather than game engine, some other thing, like what have you worked on in the past, even a small project, just give me anything that you've done for schoolwork or...
So we've worked on like Unity games and do you guys have anything?
Well, so I can the Invincible programmer said that. I worked on something with that had somewhat of a build that we needed to make. It was simple with CMake. It was just like a really, really crappy version of Photoshop. So essentially taking the different pieces we made and also something of like a switch to make a utility for hospitals to use it with things. So there's that.
Okay. I think I understand the question now. So is it correct to restate the question as follows? We have not traditionally worked on code where we actually built an executable from scratch. So we have no experience really with that process. How should it work? Is that...
Yeah, I think
okay,
that's
okay. So it's not, because I was not sure if you meant for a game engine specifically, and I was like, well, what would be different about a game engine? But you're just talking about the process of working outside of someone else's build they've handed you.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Gotcha. So I think what I would say about that is that it's a lot simpler than you think. One of the problems, so I'll veer into an anecdote here at the risk of eating up more of your time. I don't know if you guys are getting bored sitting in your chairs here. So if you ever used an email program, which by this point we all have, you may have occasionally been kind of amazed, in a sense, at how they managed to have so many bugs or so many problems in something that all it really has to do is just send a piece of text from one place to another, right? It's like one of the simplest things you could do over a network, and it's been done for decades, and it's still kind of somehow mysteriously impossible for them to get it right. So back in the old days at Bell Labs, which was obviously one of the like crucibles of software engineering, it's a place that created C and Unix, for example.
Yeah.
They had a term for this, and it was called mailer science. And it was a joke that they threw around because nobody could ever understand how the people who always ended up working on the simplest problems made the biggest mess. So it's like, why is this mail program so broken? It's like, mailer science, man. It's just mailer science. So I would offer the term build science as today's equivalent of that. Mm-hmm. We currently have some kind of weird programming culture where people, there's a term called build engineer. All I can say about that is what is going on, right? So the way to approach a build is to realize that computers today are so fast that almost any game engine you care to make, especially on a team as small as yours, can be built with a batch file in like 10 seconds. Mm-hmm. Anything you do more complicated than that is a waste of your time. People throw in integrated continuous build servers and CMake and Ninja and distributed builds and Python and all these. It's like, No, just forget all that. Get rid of it. It's not necessary. All you need to do is just make a thing that says CL, here are the files, this is the XC I want, build. That's it. On Handmade Hero, we show how to do this the first day.
Yeah.
It's trivial. You don't need anything more complicated than that, and I would encourage you to start there.
Okay.
Eventually, somewhere down the line, there are some arguments to be made, and programmers who I respect would make arguments for doing some of the slightly more complicated things like a continuous integration server when you have multiple platforms. So once you get to like, oh, we're shipping the Switch, the PlayStation 4, the Mac, the Linux, the PC build, the Xbox One build, the PS4 build of this thing, right?
Uh-huh.
It can be hard for an individual programmer to have everything installed on their machines, to keep those builds up to date, and to know if they've broken some totally other build that they don't even have the SDK for. At that point, sometimes, it becomes valuable to take that step. If you do it sensibly and make sure that it doesn't interfere with the quick, fast, simple build that you use day to day. So I would put that out there. But otherwise, especially if you're only on a single platform, a single line build is the build you want. It shouldn't be more complicated than that. Single lines, single batch file, couple lines is plenty. I would also say that there's really no excuse for build times to get above 10 seconds. There's a utility that I put out called ctime that times builds and keeps a record over time. Look at that graph. If it's crawling upwards, figure out why your builds are slow and fix them.
Okay.
So that's the advice I would have. And if you have any practical problems with that, like I said, Handmade Hero's first day just shows how to do that. Or just look at the code. I can send you our batch file after this, and you can look at it. It's super simple. Yeah. I advocate using what's called a Unity build, not related to the tool. But what that is essentially just saying, look, make a C file that just includes all the CPP files you want. Build that one CPP file. That's your build.
Okay. That's super useful information to have.
It also speeds up the build quite a bit because the fewer CPP files that the fewer translation units the compiler translates, the faster it typically goes. Because every time you split into multiple translation units, those translation units usually include some of the same H files, which increases the processing load. So by merging them all together, you process every H file only once, which can drastically speed up some builds, like by orders of magnitude sometimes, if those H files are complex.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So we're actually done with all of our questions that we have for you. The last thing we have would be, so as we said, we'd like to do a company with like the kind of edit about a 5-minute story that you have on game engine development that you think is interesting. So it can be anything of your choosing. If you have any story that you'd be willing to tell, and if not, it's totally okay as well.
Yeah, I mean, sort of the problem with that is there's lots of, I suppose, stories, but I'm not sure which one of them are really all that interesting or useful. So, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, it doesn't necessarily need to be useful at this point. This is one thing that we want to show people for the sake of programmers and maybe even other people who get into the space and see maybe the work we've done, but they don't really care about that, but they might be interested in seeing just something short that could introduce them, and then hearing something interesting about the space, like, oh wow, I didn't realize they were dealing with that, or like, that just sounded really like a really funny problem to have. It's more along the lines of that, so you don't need to necessarily have it be super useful to anybody who's watching just a 5-minute video.
You're gonna have to give me a second.
No, take your time.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I really just don't know. I mean, one of the things that's true about game development is that the things that are interesting to you are not interesting to other people. And so, I mean, I guess what I would say is that all of the things that come to mind when I think of them, I can't imagine them being particularly interesting anecdotes to anybody. Most of the time, I think when I think back about what were sort of the most interesting game development times, they were almost always in sort of circumstances where I had been looking at something the wrong way, and then, after doing quite a bit of work on it or something, realized there was sort of this other way to do it, and that insight is kind of really, really fun for the person who's been working at it. But I just don't know how to turn most of those into an anecdote. Sometimes in lectures, I've sort of told, like I had a lecture, at the Papers We Love conference, where I talked about figuring out that you could blend quaternions using linear interpolation instead of spherical linear interpolation, and how that discovery came about. And like some of those things were really exciting at the time, and there's not much you can really anecdotize about them, although I could sort of stretch one out. I think if I had to pick something to say that would go into a compendium of the kind that you're talking about, I think probably what I would say is that when I was little, because I've always been a programmer, like I said, since I was very, very young, I always wanted to program. And in those days, there was really no internet and no communication with anybody. So I didn't know any game developers, and I didn't know anything about game developers, right? I just had computers that I could program at home, and I tried to learn to program them and make games on them as best I could, and that was really all I had to go on. And my father, who was a programmer, was not a game programmer. He worked on traditional tools for Digital Equipment Corporation, which is a now defunct hardware company, right? And so most of the things that I might have wanted to know, he didn't necessarily know. Like, he didn't know hardly any 3D math or anything like that that you would use for game development, because it's just that's not common knowledge among programmers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that was really exciting for me as a young programmer was when I was still in high school. I had met over a previous summer some programmers from Microsoft, and they were going to Looking Glass, which is a company that, again, doesn't exist today, but they made a bunch of games that a lot of people consider seminal, like Ultima Underworld and System Shock and Thief the Dark Project and Flight Unlimited. Just a lot of very important games in the pantheon of games when people are talking about history. They were going there to port Flight Unlimited to Windows, because this was at the very early time when Windows didn't really run real-time games for the most part, because it didn't have a way of actually writing graphics to a back buffer like you would in DOS. And so they were going to go do that. And they asked me if I wanted to come. And my mom let me take a few days off from school. So instead of going to school, I went into Cambridge, and I got to go work on the Windows port of Flight Unlimited. And it was the first time I'd ever really set foot in a game company. And I think about that time often these days, especially because as you get older, you definitely become more sort of cynical about everything, about development, about companies, about everything you do. And it's easy to lose sight of what you love about things or what was important to you. But I think back about those days now, and it was the most magical experience. I imagine it was probably similar to if, as a lot of children grow up maybe dreaming of playing in the NBA or something, and it's like, some of those children probably randomly get to go out and shoot a free throw, with their favorite team, or something like this. And it was exactly that experience for me. Just even seeing what it looked like to walk into a game development studio and see what the people there were doing and like meet the people behind it. And I remember literally like everything about that experience. Like I remember we went to a grocery store next door called Bread and Circus, and we bought like some bread and cheese and apples and stuff and brought them back and like ate them around a lunch table. Things that are inconsequential, I'm sure, to everyone else who worked there, still like stick in my memory as like, I don't know if you can call it a formative experience, because that's a sort of different thing, I suppose. But it's definitely like, it just shows me how much of an innate draw towards this I had. And I expect that other people who, if you want to know whether this is the kind of thing you might want to be doing with your life, if that's kind of the way you feel about it, if you have those kinds of feelings, then you're probably right. But if you don't, maybe not, right? I mean, it's a hard job. It's not like playing games. It has nothing to do with that. And so I feel like you have to almost approach it from that same thing. And maybe the NBA example is pretty good. If you like watching people play basketball, that's not the same as liking playing basketball. And it's good to know which of the two you want to do. Because if you just like watching basketball, then there's no harm in having an ancillary job. You could work on the communications team for your favorite sports team, just like you might work in the production department of your favorite game company. But engine programmer is the on-the-court job that's really demanding and demands the kind of dedication, I think, in a lot of ways that an athlete has to have. You're expected to know a lot more. You're expected to work a lot harder. You're expected to to have trained your brain in such a demanding way at some level that I think you kind of have to have a certain love for it to really want to do it. And to get back to maybe one of the questions you asked me earlier, that might be why I think it's so important to try and expose more people to it, because I think there's a very limited number of people who really have the desire to do it, and finding those people is important to me, and I think that it's worth doing. And there's so many other jobs out there for a programmer to have that are not as hard as this and that aren't as demanding as this, that I think that there's plenty of other jobs for people to go to, and I think they will go to them if their heart's not really in it. So finding out if your heart is in it is good, and I would encourage people to do that as early as possible. I don't know if that's the kind of anecdote you wanted, but there you have it.
That was pretty spot on it.
Okay.
So we're actually done with all of our questions. I don't know if you have any questions for us regarding things, but if not, we really thank you for all the time you've taken. We really appreciate all of the questions you were able to answer for us and all the advice we got.
My pleasure. Those were excellent questions, and I wish you guys the best of luck on your programming project. Making a game engine is very difficult. The only piece of advice I would have is don't be too ambitious with what you try to accomplish. I always tell people make asteroids first, and it's something to be proud of if you can even do that from scratch, because most people can't. Most programmers can't. So best of luck, everybody.
Well, thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.
We'll definitely be trying to watch the Busane conference.
Okay, yeah, if you want more information on Walk Monster, it's got everything, because it's not Walk Monster. The talk's actually called Killing the Walk Monster, because we got rid of it, and I will explain how and why. So
all right, perfect.
Have a good one.
Have a...
So I'm still live here. I didn't look to see what was going on in chat. I don't know how many people. Whoa, we've got a lot of people watching, actually, I suppose. don't know if anyone has any questions. Asaf Gardner says that was fun. Cool. What was that? That was just there was a team, I believe, at Carnegie Mellon. They said so. They're in university, who is working on a game engine development project, and they were sort of saying that they wanted to, in email to me, they were saying they wanted to get some people's perspectives on just engine things as part of their project. And that seemed like a really smart thing to do. And so I just, said, sure, anything I can do to help. So this interview was just the questions that they had. And I don't know how helpful my answers are going to be, but, I just tried to provide as much information as I could that maybe is useful to the project they're trying to put together, because they're kind of putting together some learning materials too as well, I guess, for their own use and for other people's, I suppose. What is the killing the walk monster thing I was talking about? So it's there's this thing called the Busan Indie Connect. How do I? There we go. It's a festival in South Korea. I believe this is the shot from last year. It's a combination event. One of the parts of the event is that there are indie games that are going to be shown, kind of like Indie Mega Booth, or like in a festival setting. I think there's some judging to see what gets in and what doesn't, but I could be wrong about that. I'm not sure how that part of the process goes. I wasn't involved in that. But then there's also a small conference where a couple different speakers are speaking. And Chris Hecker is, I believe, going to speak on spy party stuff. I believe this is a spy party design lecture. They, for some reason, haven't put the talk descriptions up. I believe Chris has sent them one. It's just not up. So I think it's a spy party design lecture that Chris is going to do. I don't know what Tyrone is talking about, but I'm assuming he's talking about publishing work they do at Nicholas, but I don't know. I don't know what this blockchain one is about. Mine is about the walk system that I implemented for the witness. And so it's talking about the taking from the point that I wrote the original article on Walk Monster. Let me see. Oh man, this is okay. Let's try more specific. Guess there's another thing called Walk Monster. It starts with this article where I talk about what a thing I did on the witness. And shows some of the techniques that we were using early on in the project, or not necessarily early in the project, but early on in the testing of the walk system. And it starts there and goes through to discuss the final system that we developed for doing all of the walk movement and everything. And then I believe... So I think these are sponsored sessions from various different companies like Amazon. I think Nick Sutner is another invited talk though. And again, I don't know what it's on because the things aren't up here, but I believe this was also an invited talk. It's not a sponsored talk. I think like this one, and these are sponsored maybe, but I don't really know. Like I said, once they put up the descriptions, they'll be a little clearer. I don't know why they're not up yet, but they're not up yet. Anyway, so that's happening, and it's going to be recorded apparently, so it will be available afterwards. If you have a chance to come to Busan, definitely come say hi. I will be there giving that lecture. How do you find the source of excessive memory consumption when all you have to work with is a core dump As a further restriction, it's not feasible to reproduce on your local workstation because the program is an online game server and the conditions only arise under certain circumstances with a lot of active players. Well, I mean, don't you have a memory tracking system in this thing? I mean, I wouldn't ship a game server without a memory tracking system. I'm not sure what to say other than that. All of my systems, even Handmade Hero, has the ability to track the memory if you want to. And we could go further down that road. We probably will at ship time to add individual allocation tagging, which we don't do right now, but we easily could. So, I mean, that's the way you track it down. Is you just look at, for example, let's suppose that the two ways that your thing interacts with memory is malloc and free. I mean, I don't know what ways your program interacts with it, but you isolate those 2 points. You overload them with macros to pass the file and line number. Then on every memory allocation, you do a hash lookup of the file and line number, and you increment or decrement that line number's total memory allocation. And then that way, when something crashes, you can just have it dump that, and you can see exactly which line of your program is accounting for all of the memory, right? So Sadelsky, do you think a networked multi-threaded 3D engine is too ambitious for a 3-month dev period? Yes, absolutely. I would never try to do a multi-threaded 3D engine as my first engine, and I certainly wouldn't do one if I was only going to spend 3 months. Multi-threading is extraordinarily hard, and I don't think it was something you should do your first time out. Now, that said, some people's idea of multi-threading is not really multi-threading. So if you're going to do something more like a very weak multi-threaded thing, then maybe that's fine. But assuming you're actually trying to get multi-thread performance, meaning you're trying to use multi-threading to actually be faster than single-threaded, that is something that is not easy to do. A lot of people multi-thread things and end up getting slower. So I certainly wouldn't recommend doing that. Like, I would recommend, if you do want to do multi-threading on your first project, it'd be more like Handmade Hero, where it's single-threaded for the most part, and it just launches worker threads that wait for workloads that are small and localized, because that's something that it's not harder to think through. That would be my recommendation on that. I really enjoy the hard challenges in games, but don't think I have the innate drive that you do. Do you have any advice or experience with other domains that may be just as challenging? I don't know any other domains that are challenging in breadth. So game development has a breadth challenge to it that I don't know any other domains that really come close, because games kind of intersects everything. It's like photorealistic rendering and high performance optimization and servers and clients and real-time input processing and game design and all that. Like, everything comes together for games. Like, everything that humans know how to do is in a game, right? So I don't know anything in breadth, but in terms of just finding hard problems, I mean, there's tons of things. Go work on molecular modeling for protein synthesis. I mean, go work on figuring out how to better synthesize X-ray imaging, or how to do 3D visualization of CAT scans. Like, there's tons of things in the medical field you could be doing, or in biology. You could go into security research, right? Like, how do we secure the power grid? How do we prevent cyber warfare things? How do we harden routers? Like, all of these sorts of things. You go into operating system development, right? Hard real-time operating systems, tons of stuff to work on there. There's so many fields that have hard problems in them. So you can easily find other hard problems in programming. And game development is unique, I think, more not because it has hard problems. I think there are hard problems there. It's the breadth. It's the breadth of the problems that's interesting in game development. That's what really sets it apart. Not the depth. I think every programming discipline has the depth. It's the breadth that's different about game development. see if there's anything else on here. Foobar count. Been programming for about 6 years, hobbyist and currently university. Always struggled to push a game project to completion. Do you have any advice on how to see any project to its end? No, I'm bad at that. I just like working on technology, so I'm not really good at pushing game projects to completion. Pushing tech projects to completion, I might have better advice for. Game projects, I don't. I would ask John Blow. I would really seriously try to get on his stream and ask John Blow. Because he is someone who has both had trouble pushing game projects to completion and not had trouble pushing game projects to completion. And I think he would be the perfect person to talk about that difference and the things you can do to try to get over that difference as fast as possible. And I don't have the necessary experience to offer advice, you know. Kind of go haphazard through these questions here. I don't guarantee that I'm going to answer all of these. Are you into isometrics? How would you approach creating a game in isometrics without using 3D? Well, isometrics are a lot easier because there's everything has a universal sort order. So you can usually just draw front to back and be done with isometrics because there's no perspective happening there. So I think that should probably be okay, but maybe not. I guess now that I say that, it's not really true. I don't know if you read Andrew Russell's post about this. I always spell his name wrong. I'm sorry, Andrew. I always spell it more like Russell, I think the first name. But this is kind of a good post about how it's not actually that easy, isometrics. This is kind of an interesting way to talk about how here's another one, right? I might refer you to that because I guess now I think about it, it's not really that straightforward. This year at a big database conference, there were 2 papers about avoiding the penalties of cache misses by prefetching and then using a coroutine to do work while the cache is being fetched. Do you see any applications for this in games? It sounds a little weird. I mean, it's not the weirdest idea. So first of all, a cache miss is not that expensive, right? So a cache miss is going to be like what, like 300 cycles, 400 cycles? Usually in game development, we're pretty good when we start getting down to that part of the project of figuring out how to interleave things we want to do so that we always have something we can do math on while we're fetching, you know? So like, do I think I would want an entire system for doing a coroutine in a 300 cycle window, especially given that hyperthreading does that automatically? So if I just have 2 threads that are doing stuff for my game on the same core, when I hit the 300 cycle bubble, the other thread will take over. I mean, that's not literally what happens, but the other thread can issue instructions into the ALUs, into the execution ports, right? it doesn't sound that useful, but you know, I haven't read the papers. It sounds like something we already kind of know how to work around or are usually good enough at doing. That I can't say it excites me. Like, I'm not itching to go read that paper. It doesn't sound like one that's going to be high on my list, I guess is all I'd say. But, you know, until I actually read it, I'm not going to, I won't dismiss it because, you know, maybe there's more to it there, you know. So. Any schedule for next week? No, I will be posting a schedule when I get back from Busan because I'll be in South Korea for a week. So until I get back, I'm not going to post schedule. And I won't be streaming from there. Do you think John's language will make game programming easier in a significant way as opposed to just limiting some annoyances? Yeah, I mean, hard for me to say. I haven't looked at it in depth. But the metaprogramming features that are in it are so much better than the ones in C++ that you could really dramatically improve your programming by using them. It is not as simple as eliminating an annoyance. Now, how good those metaprogramming features actually are in practice at the end of the day, I don't know until I actually have a chance to play with them. But I mean, the difference between C++ and JAI in terms of the ability to like really leverage code is going to be, I mean, it's not even going to be close. You know, C++ offers no meaningful metaprogramming at all. It's almost completely useless for metaprogramming. So, you know, that's going to be a pretty huge change. Could you explain a bit about AZDO? I mean, I can explain a little bit about it, but I'm not sure what I'm going to say that's not going to be the same as what, you know, if you just go read it, like an NVIDIA tutorial or something. But the idea, AZDO stands for Approaching Zero Driver Overhead. For those of you who don't know, and sorry, if I got one of those terms wrong, I apologize. The acronyms fly all over the place in this industry, but AZDO is basically acknowledging the fact that a modern 3D graphics card, like an NVIDIA 1080, like the one in this machine, is a processor in its own right. I mean, it could run a whole game over there, right? Like it's not made for that, so there's a bunch of things it does inefficiently if you were to try and run an entire game over there. But it's a full processor, right? And so the extent to which it needs the main processor to handhold its execution is pretty minimal. So what AZDO attempts to do is say, look, if we just prepare buffers in memory, so when we're in the game, we just prepare buffers that are formatted appropriate for the card's consumption, we should be able to have the driver do almost nothing. It should be able to just kind of, you know, knock on the card's door and say, hey, I've got a new set of data and code for you to execute, do it. And that's it. So rather than the driver sitting there like manhandling when the GPU is going to do this and do that and checking for states and changing the states and recompiling shaders, AZDO is just about saying, look, let's just prepare actually correct execution buffers for the GPU that have all the stuff in them it needs, that it can just read. And then what we're going to do is just tell the GPU, read it, go. And so the driver becomes much less involved and frees up a bunch of CPU time for you to use for your game. That's all it is, really. You know, the devil's in the details, but that's the concept. I think that's all the questions. All right. I'm going to close it down here.